Welcome to Friends and Fiction. 4 New York Times bestselling authors, endless stories. Novelists Mary Kay Andrews, Kristin Harmel, Kristy Woodson Harvey, and Patti Callahan Henry are 4 longtime friends with more than 70 published books between them. Together, they host Friends and Fiction, with author interviews and fascinating insider talk about publishing and writing, to highlight and support independent bookstores. They discuss the books they've written, the books they're reading now, and the art of storytelling. If you love books and you're curious about the writing world, you're in the right place.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Friends and Fiction Show. I'm Mary Kay Andrews.
And I'm Ron Block.
And this is Friends and Fiction, 4 New York Times bestselling authors, endless stories to support indie bookstores, authors, and librarians. If you're not a member of us already, we hope you'll join our Facebook group, which is more than 250,000 members strong. We'd also like to invite you to follow us on Instagram and YouTube and subscribe to our Substack newsletter, which is full of awesome bonus content. You can find out more about our community and all we have to offer at friendsandfiction.com.
And I'm here to remind you about the Friends and Fiction 2025 book subscription box, available only through our friends at Oxford Exchange. For one all-in price, you'll get 3 separate shipments in 2025. In March, you'll get Patti's new book. In May, with Kristy's. And in June, with Kristin's. I get their names. Their names are too close. All of them signed, all of them hardcover first editions. Plus, you'll get exclusive gifts and a Friends and Fiction friendship bracelet and car magnet that are available only in this bundle. So visit Oxford Exchange now to get yours. You can link to that from our website too at friendsandfiction.com.
On this episode, we are thrilled to welcome Scott Turow to discuss his new novel, Presumed Guilty, which just came out January 14th. And we are so excited to speak to Scott about it. Scott Turow is a writer and a former practicing attorney. He is the author of 13 best-selling works of fiction, including Presumed Innocent and Suspect.
Scott has also published 2 nonfiction books, including 1L, about his experience as a Harvard law student. His books have been translated into more than 40 languages, sold more than 30 million copies worldwide, and have been adapted into movies and television projects. In fact, his novel Presumed Innocent was the basis for Apple TV's most watched drama series ever, starring Jake Gyllenhaal. And what a show that was. Oh my God. Scott has frequently contributed essays and op-ed pieces to publications such as the New York Times, Washington Post, Vanity Fair, The New Yorker, and The Atlantic.
Scott Turow's new novel, Presumed Guilty, was just released on January 14th, and our friend, New York Times bestselling author Kristin Harmel, called it unputdownable. So, Sean, can you bring Scott on?
Hey.
Greetings, all.
Hi, Scott. Welcome to Friends and Fiction. We're so glad to have you. Good. And I apologize for these bags under my eyes because I stayed up until 4:30 a.m. this week. I would say that I was binging Presumed Guilty. I can't say I read it as much as really I was consumed by it. So let's get right into it.
Well,
Kathy,
you know yourself that that's music to an author's ear. So thank you for saying that.
Well, it's absolutely true. Now, Rusty Sabich was the protagonist of your first blockbuster novel, 1987, Presumed Innocent, and then the 2010 sequel, Innocent. Now, he's a complicated guy who's had his own troubles with the law, and now he's back 15 years later with Presumed Guilty. Was a trilogy a part of your grand plan?
Well, when I was writing Presumed Innocent, I had no grand plan besides getting published. So the idea of a trilogy really didn't begin to form until 20 years after Presumed Innocent, when I decided to write a sequel, Innocent. And then at the end of Innocent, I really felt I didn't feel happy about where I had left Rusty, which was just emerging from prison with much of his life shattered. And I was sort of curious in my own imagination whether he could survive that experience and what would become of him. So I thought I would go back, and I am.
Now, what are the pleasures and pitfalls of writing, such a complicated, flawed character like Rusty? I mean, we're all flawed, but Rusty's flaws, a lot of his flaws happen to play out in a courtroom.
Right. He's not a perfect person. And, at the age of 77, he thinks that he finally recognizes that. But even so, as presumed guilty demonstrates, he's not in complete control of himself.
No, he's not. And Scott, congratulations on another stunner. This is, like Kathy said, this kept me up at night. I just couldn't put it down, and the pages kept going. I couldn't wait.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You've been dubbed the father of the legal thriller, and GQ recently called you the best legal thriller writer ever to approach the bench. We know your work has inspired the likes of John Grisham, Lisa Scottolini, Alistair Burke, and so many more. But here's a question on behalf of all the writers out there. How do you balance explaining the technical aspects of a criminal trial without getting your story bogged down in lawyery stuff?
Well, I mean, that's obviously one of the challenges, especially for somebody like me, who not only still remains a practicing lawyer, albeit with only one case on the docket, but even worse than that, I'm somebody who thinks the law is interesting and always have. So that's always a challenge, and you're wise to mention it. But when I first recognized, after years sort of in the desert struggling to get published, that, I was a young prosecutor by then, and I was standing in a courtroom, and I was watching the rapt attention with which a courtroom full of spectators was watching the star witness in a relatively low-level criminal prosecution, watching him testify. I said, this stuff is interesting to everybody, not just to me. And that's always been my perspective. And it really is a challenge not to overload the book with technical detail. At the same time, I don't antagonize part of my core audience, which has always been practicing lawyers who will often write and say, the thing I like about your books is you don't cheat. The rules are the rules. And so, that's the balance that I'm always trying to strike.
Right. Now, in this novel, in Presumed Guilty, you've got a young Black man, Aaron. He's been raised in a mostly was engaged to Rusty Savage. Aaron is accused of the violent murder of his high school girlfriend, May Potter, who just happens to be the daughter of the most powerful, politically connected family in the region. Now, race, politics, power, and the inherent injustice of these systems play a big part in the plot of Presumed Guilty. And I know you did pro bono criminal defense work for years. So was that maybe part of what made you feel compelled to write this story with this young man?
I don't think that the inherent biases in the criminal justice system are something that I've newly discovered, and they obviously cropped up in my fiction before, and frankly, before you get to race and social class, you just have the fact that, generally speaking, most jurors walk into a criminal courtroom assuming that the man or woman across the courtroom who's sitting at the defense table is guilty, because, of course, it's a reality that if our justice system is working correctly, most criminal defendants are guilty, and so there are all kinds of presumptions that work against the criminal defendant. every time I start writing one of these books, I find that the circumstances themselves call up new things that I don't think I've written about before. And, in this case, one of those, when we're talking about, predisposition, is I certainly spend more time talking about jury selection and jury composition than I think I have at any time in the past. And that, of course, has become a bigger and bigger part of trying lawsuits, keeping an eye on who's sitting in the box. People no longer are naive enough to believe that you can pick any 12 people and get the same result.
That's true. That's true. So in the book, there's so many secrets to peel back. It reminds us of those Russian nesting dolls. You open up one character only to find another one underneath. We found B, Rusty's fiance, a particularly fascinating enigma because we get to see so many different layers of her personality. And she's a great foil for Rusty. Where did she come from?
I've always said that if you're doing well, there's always a character who runs away with the novel, in the sense that, his or her role becomes either larger or deeper than you first anticipated. And, certainly as I was figuring out this book, it's no surprise that B, in many, many ways, is the emotional center of this novel. She's loved by her son, loved by her son's lawyer, even perhaps loved by people who shouldn't be in love with her, as the novel as the novel ultimately discloses. And so I just found her more and more intriguing to me, and I hope I got some of that on the page. She's somebody who's grown up in essentially a small town setting, and always wanted to leave, but never has. So she's got an eye on the outside world, but she's still in many ways a small town person.
Right. And she's certainly compelling. And speaking of compelling characters, B, but also Rusty, what do you think it is about Rusty that endures for us as readers, for sure? Because we never shy away from applauding a new story about Rusty, but you and a storyteller with Rusty, what do you think makes him endure with people?
If I'm being really honest, Rusty's voice is probably closer to my own than any other character that I have written about. And so it's not a shock to me, but obviously gratifying that he comes across with a certain authenticity, even though, he's got a very checkered past, some moments in the past that in retrospect, I would say shame him. And again, even now he finds that past undermines his confidence in the present. But he speaks more as I speak than any other character I write. And so it's both easier for me as the writer to find his voice and to come back to his voice. And I'm glad to know that it's compelling to readers.
Oh, for sure.
I think that's the big difference between Rusty and say one of the other compelling characters in the novel, Joe, who is Bee's dad. Rusty is capable of shame, and Rusty has achieved a level of self-awareness, and Joe has managed to escape that.
Well, I loved writing Joe, and he's somebody who's come from real deprivation. His mom was a member of the Winnebago Nation and met his father when they were both migrant farm workers. The dad is of Mexican heritage. And, his family basically disappeared when he was,
Right.
in the junior high school age. And he's made his way on his own in the world without many advantages. Went to Vietnam, became one of the first of the tunnel rats, which, based on the experience of a friend of mine, was just moments of pure terror at war. And so he survived a lot. And, as is common with people with that kind of a deprived background, he's unrelentingly tough. And like a lot of people with a deprived background, I don't think he's ever fully escaped the feeling that what he didn't have was because he's a less worthy person. And that means that to admit to himself that he's made a mistake always puts him on this precipice where he's going to just dive into a pit of shame from which he can never extract himself. And so it becomes impossible for him to feel shame because he experiences that as almost life-threatening. So he's comic, of course, and meant to be in his inability to admit his mistakes. As Rusty says, he's been known to change his opinion in the middle of a sentence and to pretend that he didn't say what he had said 1 minute before. But I think, in that he's familiar to a lot of people, especially people who are familiar with older folks. And Joe is now in his early 80s in this novel.
Yeah. Let's switch gears for a minute. Let's talk about your journey to becoming a novelist. It's pretty unique. I read in an interview that you'd always wanted to be a novelist since you graduated from high school and that then after college and your time in the Stanford Writing Fellowship, studying the law felt like a calling you couldn't ignore. Could you talk to us about how you shifted gears from aspiring novelist with a book ready to shop, by the way, to a law student? And then how that led to your first published book, which was nonfiction, 1L, the turbulent true story of a first year at Harvard Law School.
Right. Well, this is a long story, so you guys should feel free to interrupt me as I tell it. But
no way.
I not only had I always dreamt of being a novelist, but when I began, when I was an undergraduate, I could see these red banded announcements announcing the Stanford Writing Fellowships in the college English department. And so, and like a lot of young people, I had the illusion that there was some kind of external marker that would turn me into a writer, as opposed to, what I did myself. So, but I was thrilled to get out to Stanford, and by the way, with very good reason. I was surrounded by a huge community of really talented writers. Some are famous names like Raymond Carver or Alice Hoffman or Richard Price. Some are not quite as famous, but have had really nice, steady careers as novelists, like my friend April Smith, for example. And they all knew what they were doing. They really were thinking hard about the purposes of fiction and the way fiction works, and that part of it was a great experience. What was less great for me was my own work, and which at the end of the day was really burdened by this demand that I somehow achieve something great. Which let me tell your audience something. It's there's a saying that, there aren't many Mozarts in the courtroom, and there are not many Mozarts sitting behind a computer either. Writing well, as most of us learn, is a process of, as my friend Tom Zigel, another friend from my Stanford days, likes to put it, of logging a lot of pages. But aside from a couple of experiences, ironically, before I'd gotten to Stanford, I didn't feel like I was really in touch with, what I'd call my stuff, the things that boiled around inside me that I wanted to consolidate and get on the page. And so, I felt that I was failing in it. And beyond that, I've been lucky enough to get hired for one of these steerage level faculty positions at Stanford as a lecturer in the English department. And I was discovering that while it's a great life for many people, I was not somebody who wanted to become an English professor. So I was really at a loss as to what I was going to do. And, particularly and a lot of writers end up blundering into academic life because, it's the best way to support themselves and still have time to write. But, I was afraid of going down that path. So I began to think about the alternatives. And one of the things I noticed is that the friends I was making in the Bay Area who weren't writers, and I made many close friendships at Stanford that endure to this day, but the ones who weren't writers tended to be almost to a person lawyers. And I loved listening to what they were doing, especially the criminal lawyers. And then when I kind of took another step back, I realized that, most of my college friends had gone to law school, and they, for the most part, were loving what they were doing as young lawyers. And I began to think, holy smokes, is this something that I want to do? And, I began studying to take the LSAT. And I even enjoyed that. And so even though I'd been offered a really good job as it happens, the university in the East where my sister had been an undergraduate. So I knew it was a great place. Despite having been offered that job, I decided that I was going to go to law school. So now we get to the hard part, which is I really did not want to give up my dream of being a novelist. And, my friends, in one of those bygone sexist phrases, used to say to me that, the law is a jealous mistress, meaning it doesn't leave you much time to do anything else. And my proposition that I was going to both write and practice law brought guffaws to my closest friends. But that was what I intended to do, but it sounded pretty lame. And I had to then write to the literary agent who was trying to sell that book that I had written at Stanford. And the book itself had propelled my interest in the law. And I'm going to pause 1 second to take a drink of water because after my long-windedness, my throat's getting scratchy. So, the agent, the very successful and prominent agent who was representing me, was somebody who enjoyed the 3 martini lunch in New York in those days. I was on the West Coast, which meant that by the time I got up and drove my wife to school where she was teaching and got back home, she was gone for lunch. And after the 3 martinis, there was no communicating. So I decided I'd write her a letter. I got to the middle of this letter and said, I'm going to keep writing. I'm sitting there writing the letter. I think, God, this sounds really lame. This sounds completely unconvincing. So I pitched out this idea for a nonfiction book about law school because there hadn't been anything I could find that was really a day-to-day account of the life of a law student. And I really didn't have in mind that I would write this book. I was sort of trying to give her an idea that would be perhaps commercially viable. But it was, sort of symptomatic of the miscommunications between us that she thought I was proposing to write the book. She showed the letter to an editor in New York. He thought it was a grand idea because one of his sons had gone to law school. And he, on the spot, commissioned this book, which became 1L. So there arrives for me in San Francisco a very thick envelope. And I was accustomed to getting thin envelopes from my agent, which were namely a cover letter saying, here's another one, and a very polite rejection letter from one of the editors who didn't want to publish the novel that I'd written while I was at Stanford. Now this was a thick envelope, and it had that contract inside. And the irony in my life has never been deeper. I mean, the Education of Henry Adams contains a phrase that I've stolen repeatedly throughout my writing career: sabering irony, the sabering irony of realizing that I'd always wanted to publish a book. And here I was being given the opportunity to do it as soon as I said that I was, stepping away from a literary career. But I did not hesitate. I signed the contract. And as I sometimes like to joke at my own expense, I went off to Harvard Law School to make new friends and to write about. So,
That's a heck of a journey.
It's a great story.
You for sharing that. I love it. So you've described going to law school as the great break of your literary career. Tell us why
Right.
you think that is so, and then how your career as a lawyer informed not just your writing, but also the craft itself.
Well, I've sort of I've given you the first answer to your question, Ron, because the first thing that happened when I decided to go to law school was I got this contract to write a book.
Right.
And that 1L became the foothold to my literary career. I still am told routinely by people that, they've read 1L. And in many cases, it's what introduced people to my work. So, but beyond that, the interest that I felt in the law, it turned out that I had taken my own measure really well. I really was interested in law in a way that I was not candidly interested in, English literary scholarship. It spoke to central puzzles in my own character, mostly about the uses and abuses of power, I think. But whatever it was, it really intrigued me. By the time I became a young prosecutor, I really went to work excited to be there, but kind of just boiling over every day with all that was going on. The struggle with defense lawyers to prove that their clients were guilty, and devices, and the judges would sometimes be quite unforgiving with the young prosecutors, and surrounded by wonderful colleagues, great younger lawyers who too remain dear friends to this day. But there was just so much going on emotionally, and then there was just the drama of the criminal process itself. And as I alluded to before, when we started talking about this, I was standing in the court one day, and I'd gone on writing. I'd written a novella that met the same fate as everything else I had written, although there's a sort of footnote to that story. But and for some reason, I turned around and I looked at the fact that the courtroom was full, and people were breathless watching this witness on the stand. Now, it was what you would call a really minor case. These guys were on trial for conspiring to steal food stamps and sell them. But people were just absolutely awestruck by just the story of how somebody decides to do something that his community regards as loathsome and wrong. And I suddenly thought to myself, this is it, man. This is your subject. This is what you're most deeply interested in. This is, and I'd always been, because I was in this highfalutin environment in the Stanford English department, always been interested in that subject and those books that could, as I put it to one of my colleagues, appeal to both a bus driver and an English professor. And I realized, okay, here we go. Here is the subject matter that somehow seems to captivate everybody. And that's how I really got started on the writing of Presumed Innocent.
What a big light bulb moment. Wow.
Yeah, right. And then, in terms of, I was lucky enough not to be confused about what the voice of fiction was. I didn't think I was going to write novels in my lawyer voice. And I had enough training in writing by then that I understood that, there are different voices for different callings and different kinds of written projects. But there were things I really learned in the practice of law that nobody ever impressed on me as a writing fellow at Stanford. And that started with, number one, every word I wrote was not deathless. And no matter how hard it was for me to cut the fiction I was writing, I had learned in the courtroom, if you have a 15-page limit for a brief, then it does not mean 16 and a half pages because the writing is so great. It means 15 pages. And, I learned trying cases to a jury. If I wanted to write books that would be of interest to both the English professor and the bus driver, I learned a lot about the capacities of a popular audience. And that, some of the stuff that I thought was schmaltzy, it worked every time. These defense lawyers would stand up and pretend to throw their papers on the floor so that they, the jury would think they were, they weren't crafty and that, they were just almost stumble bumps. And I knew that was baloney. I tried 3 cases against the guy and watched him drop his papers every time. But it worked. It worked with that popular audience sitting in the jury box. And so, I just accepted the fact that you were much in like the questions that you asked me earlier. You were going to, first and foremost, you had to hold people's interest. And you had to therefore accommodate yourself to what they were going to be curious about.
Great.
Yeah.
Great approach.
I always remember the great Elmore Leonard's words, which were, somebody asked him what was the secret to his success. And he said he left out the parts in the story that people skipped over.
That's always a tough question because,
yeah,
the bus driver might be interested in skipping certain parts that the English professor might not. So, I try to tame my impulse to be deeply philosophical or emotional or lyrical. But I admit there are times that, I succumb to these excursions in psychology that, people who are just reading for plot may have limited patience for.
I don't know about that. I keep thinking, and I wasn't going to ask you this question, but Rusty makes a speech towards the end of the story and I'm going to read it. And maybe you'll know what I'm talking about. Values matter. Ideas matter. Sorting wrong from right, the law's most basic task, dignifies our lives, sets a path that most of us who aspire to see ourselves as good people try to follow, even knowing that there are those whose past rob them of that desire and leave them feeling at heart that crime and banishment are not their truest destiny. And I thought that was kind of a Shakespearean moment. And I salute you.
Yeah,
Well,
definitely.
Not that you read it for me.
it sounds pretty good as you read it. So,
Yeah, it does.
yeah, that's an epiphanal moment near the end of the book, and somebody is run down what Rusty does and tells him that it's all about pretty words, and you sit in the courtroom and you talk, but the people who really get things done, are the poor slobs, quote unquote, who end up having to put people in jail or press the button in the death chamber. And people like Rusty are just remote from all of that stuff. And it's meant to be an intense criticism rooted in social class. And so the passage you were nice enough to read and read so well is a response to that criticism.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to switch gears again and talk about the sense of place in your novels. Your fictional Kendall County and in Presumed Guilty, Rusty's moved to Skagion. Is that how you say it?
I've always pronounced it Skagion, but of course,
Skagion. Okay.
one of the advantages is we write fiction. We don't have to say anything out loud until at least the audio book. But I've always said Skagion.
So, yeah. Okay. So Skagion, these counties are so imbued in Midwest sensibility. And, I'm guessing that your own upbringing inspired the settings.
Oh, well, I mean, I grew up in the city of Chicago. And
Right.
as I used to say when I was at Stanford, I was out in California, but my dreams were still taking place in Chicago. Chicago remains deeply rooted in me, even though Adrian and I left about 7 years ago, as happens with many people who just can't take the winters anymore. But we're back in the summers. And one of the places we spend time when we're back in the Midwest is in a house that I've owned for 30 years that's across the state line in southern Wisconsin, in an area that bears more than a passing resemblance to Skagion County. And that means that there's, on one side of this county, there's a sort of summer luxury area around a big, beautiful lake. And on the other side, there's actually a poor, somewhat blighted city that was, part of the Rust Belt. And in the middle, there's this area that's principally rural and, dotted with small lakes where less affluent summer residents tend to show up. So, and I've experienced this now for more than 30 years. So, this Skagion County is not completely Kenosha County, but it bears some resemblance. There's no doubt about that.
Right. And we know you spend winters, part of the year, in Southwest Florida. Any thoughts of ever setting a book there?
Well, part of the book before last, The Last Trial, Sandy Stern, who is the protagonist of that book and was Rusty Savage's defense lawyer and presumed innocent. Sandy, for business reasons, has to go down to Florida. My friends and neighbors have not enjoyed as much as I did. Stern can't stand Florida. He thinks it's prison camp for America's elderly, as he puts it. And And, obviously, if that was the way I felt, I wouldn't be here. But some of them have a hard time squaring my presence with the fact that my beloved character doesn't think much of the place where I live. But, he's who he is, and I'm who I am.
Okay, switching gears again a little bit. What was it like seeing Presumed Innocent adapted again for the current Apple TV series, something like 36 years after the book was first published?
Yeah. Well, as I have said more than once, you're getting old when you're alive to see the remake. And
Sure.
this, it's what always blows me away. And I've been lucky enough to see a lot of films made from my novels. And it's just, you get to the set, and we went to the set on Presumed Innocent. So it happened that they were filming the courtroom scenes. So in addition to the huge staff of people who are trying to make this real, you've also got, 300 extras sitting there. So there's this vast number of people who've got their shoulder to the wheel trying to make real or visible something that, started out in your heart, in your head. And that's always thrilling. There's from what I've been able to see from the outside, there's never really any telling in advance whether a film is going to work or not. But Presumed Innocent, the series, ended up being one of those small miracles that happens in filmmaking. That everything came together. It certainly started with David E. Kelley, who did the adaptation, who's one of the biggest, if not the biggest names among contemporary TV writers, and who's got a genius for figuring out what the American television audience wants to watch and is going to be beguiled by. And that goes back to his days writing Ally McBeal and Picket Fences before that. And now, Big Little Lies and, Goliath and series like that. He's an incredibly talented guy. And it was his vision more than anybody else's that propelled this. But he was, in a very close second, Dustin Thomason from J.J. Abrams' shop, Bad Robot. And Dusty is the person who was on the set and ran the set. And he's a very fine writer in his own right. And between the two of them, between Dusty and David, they were the real creative force that made this happen.
Yeah, it's quite a resume they all have. And I'll reiterate that it's Apple TV's most watched drama series ever. But there's some differences in this one. There's a different color at the end. How did that sit with you?
It first of all, and it was one of those weird moments, all of a sudden, Dusty called me first. 3 weeks later, David calls me. There's another producer. Everybody all of a sudden got this idea. Let's remake Presumed Innocent. But one thing that Dusty said and David said from the start is, look, this book was written 35 years ago. There have to be some changes. And I accepted that. Even just talking about plot, when I wrote Presumed Innocent, DNA had not made its forceful entry into the world of courtroom evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And if you really think back to the facts of Presumed Innocent, if they were written in the novel, Rusty Savage had no chance. He would have been convicted in a heartbeat because of DNA. So, and that's just emblematic of the kinds of changes that had to be made. I knew as I began to read the scripts when they were nice enough to send them to me, as they were being written, that I could see that David was going to be prepared to go in a different direction at the end. And I've never really sat down and had a conversation with him about why he made that choice. But you can see the basic commercial necessity that I'm
Sure.
lucky that this is a famous book and people know the shock ending. And so if you don't have a new ending, you're kind of giving up something that's really important and drawing people into the story. So the other weird thing that happened is that David turned in that final script minutes before the writer's strike began, which meant the way the union agreements work, nobody at any time to give David any comments about that ending. So it filmed as it was written. That's always the writer's dream anyway. And I've been told by the actors that there were two alternative endings that they had heard, whispered about. And again, I haven't had a chance to ask David what they were or whether that's even whether that's true. But, it went down just fine with this huge audience that watched the series.
Yeah.
It sure did.
Proof that it worked.
Lax to not mention too that it was great. They had over the update though, they had to put all these technology aspects into the news series,
Right,
which weren't in the original.
Of course, because the technology of the courtroom has changed so much.
Okay, is there a green light for presumed guilty for the screen?
I'm the short answer is yes. Presumed guilty has been optioned. I'm thrilled to be able to say that. And perhaps if there was less going on, sadly, in Los Angeles right now, I might be able to share some of the details of the team that's going to be working on this. But I can't right now because people are otherwise preoccupied out there, which I send them, my heartfelt best wishes and prayers.
It's heartbreaking.
It's unbelievable what's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah,
we all send our thoughts to what folks are going through. Okay, Scott, if you will stick around, we've got more to talk to you about. But first, a few quick reminders for our listeners and viewers out there.
For all of you watching and listening, we encourage you to rush out and buy your copies of Presumed Guilty, and trust me, you want to. The perfect place to do that is in the Friends and Fiction shop on bookshop.org. You'll not only be getting it at a discount, but all your purchases there support our show, our guests, and indie bookstores nationwide. And don't forget to visit friendsandfiction.com for details on our show schedule, upcoming in-person events, and links to the award-winning Friends and Fiction official book club with Brenda and Lisa, our merch store, and our Substack newsletter sign-up. Whew, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. Speaking of Substack, you can read all our free weekly posts on the Substack website or app, or subscribe for free to get them directly. Subscribe to get them directly in your inbox. If you upgrade to our paid Substack, which costs $5 a month, you'll have access to deeper dives with all our weekly show guests, plus monthly roundtable discussions. And the four of us also host occasional private VIP Zooms for our paid subscribers. If you enjoy tuning in, this is a big way you can support us for basically the cost of a single cup of coffee each month. Check us out at friendsandfiction.substack.com.
Awesome. Okay, Scott, back to you. After 14
Thank you.
novels,
And Delay, if I may interrupt for 1 second.
Sure.
Sure.
I want to echo your support for bookshop.org. It's a great site, and for those of us who, without trying to pick battles with Jeff Bezos, don't want to see Amazon control everything, it's a great alternative.
yeah, it's really made a difference, I think, for indie bookstores. So it's worth supporting. Okay, after 14 novels, a couple works of nonfiction, and a decades-long career practicing law, what is next for you? Are you going to be writing more books?
Yes. I mean, I actually gave myself space and time when I finished this one. And, to basically look in the mirror and say, am I done? Have I said what I wanted to say? And as important, do I still really enjoy the process? Because there are times, we all know, it's a lot of hard work. And the short answer is yes. I really enjoy the process. I want to do it again. And I'm just in the beginning phases, conceptualizing a new book. But basically, an elderly lawyer looks at the obituaries, as elderly folk do, and he sees an obituary that he finds completely startling, because he thinks the person, he's believed for decades that person whose death notice he's reading had been murdered by one of his clients. So that's how we start.
Oh man, what a hook.
I know. We'll get that next week, right? We're going to.
All right, Scott, can you tell us tell everybody who's watching and listening where they can find you online, and if you're going to tour in the coming weeks?
Well, let's see. Online, I'm on Instagram, and I have a Facebook page. In the next few days, I'll be in Vero Beach, Florida, in Miami, Florida, including speaking of independent bookstores, the wonderful Books and Books in Coral Gables.
Yes.
Everybody knows and loves the proprietor, Mitchell Kaplan. I'm going from there to Wake Forest. I think it's called Wake Books. I should have my schedule in front of me, because I shouldn't be surprised by the question. Go there after that, I'm going to St. Louis Public Library, and then back to Tallahassee, Florida, at Florida State University. So that'll be the first week, and then there'll be appearances at the Savannah Book Festival, the Tucson Book Festival.
I'm going to that. Maybe I'll see you.
Maybe we'll see each other then. That'll be really nice. So probably make a stop in LA, stop in Chicago, of course, at the wonderful bookstall, Blue Books in Kenosha. So I'll be around, and I'm grateful to see everybody, and grateful that anybody cares about what I say.
Scott, thanks so much for talking about Presumed Guilty today and Presumed Innocent. It's such a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks for being with us on Friends in Fiction.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you. It's been amazing. Be sure to tune in next week when Kristy and Mary Kay Andrews will welcome Lisa Genova to discuss her novel that's new, More or Less Maddie. The show will air live on the Friends in Fiction Facebook page and YouTube channel on Wednesday, January 29th at 7 p.m. Eastern. It will be published to our podcast for your listening pleasure on Friday, January 31st.
Thanks, everybody, for coming out there to watch us today, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in. You can join us every week on Facebook or YouTube, where our live show airs on Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Also, subscribe to our podcast and follow us on Instagram. We're so glad you're here.